Hello, dear friends. This is Sofya Dorinskaya with you, President of the International Bureau for Human Rights in Mental Health and head of the Sofya Dorinskaya Center for Medical Information. Today, I would like to talk about whether children need television, whether children need the internet, and whether children really need this constant stream of external images. And most importantly, what should you do if your child has already, so to speak, become attached to these external sources of information? Today I want to tell you that every person has a certain ability, a certain quality. This is a quality of the human mind, a quality inherent in every person. This is the ability to fantasize, to imagine. This quality of imagination is inherent in every person. And there is such an observation that this is one of the main functions of the mind and one of the main qualities of the mind. Moreover, I think you've heard the expression that man is king. The most important weapon a person has is their mind. Why? Because one of the differences between humans and animals, specifically between the human mind and the animal mind, is a very strong, highly developed capacity for imagination. And this ability is so natural, so powerful, that if a person is deprived of it, if it is somehow destroyed or restricted, a person can go insane. I think you've heard stories that when people were placed, even in the past, in solitary confinement, they would lose their minds without communication. If a person was put in some kind of prison cell without light, again, solitary confinement with no one to talk to. And for a person, this is a very severe form of torture, when someone is deprived of this function of the mind, of imagination. And in general, if the accumulated information is insufficient for the imagination to work, then a person really does go insane. So what exactly is the major problem when young children sit for hours in front of the TV? The core problem is that this vital internal function of human imagination, it sort of gradually disappears from a person's own inner mind and instead becomes an entirely external source of imagination provided by the screen. A person no longer needs to imagine pictures themselves. For example, when you read fairy tales to a child out loud, the child imagines various pictures in their head, and they come up with what a certain character looks like, and so on and so forth. But when a person is shown what something looks like, specifically that picture, especially from an early age, this innate ability to imagine begins to atrophy. But since this ability still needs to be present, when you deprive a child of an external source of imagination, it can lead to psychosis. Simply put, we observe that a person just goes insane. But the same thing happens as, for example, when in ancient times people were put in solitary confinement without light, without sounds, without anything. It's the same thing. There, a person was deprived of this ability, their capacity to imagine was restricted. Now, this is done through external sources. If you even look at societies where people grew up with television, like American society, and those who grew up with books, like Russian society, right? So I'm a person who, honestly, until 7th grade, when I was 14, we practically didn't have a TV. Ours had been broken for a long time, and we would go to my grandmother's house once a week to watch a movie. Other than that, we didn't have a TV at home. And it was only when I turned 14 that we bought a color television. Yes, of course, we did spend a certain amount of time on it, but since I basically grew up without a TV, I'm just not interested. Later on, I realized that I was simply wasting my time and that television didn't play any significant role in my life. Yes, I even sometimes turn off the internet because I realize that, well, there's this physical feeling that my mind just wants to think for itself, not just absorb what others are saying. So, if you compare people who grew up with television to those who grew up with books, you'll find that the survival rate of people who grew up with books, that is, people whose own imagination is trained, is much higher than that of people who grew up relying on external sources for their imagination. These people have better speech. These people, those who grew up with books, they can look at life situations and sometimes come up with solutions so ingenious that it's unlikely anyone who spent their whole life watching television could find them, for one simple reason. These people from birth do not have an atrophied imagination. Moreover, the more a person was read to as a child and later read books on their own, the more this function of imagination is honed. And when a person observes the world around them, they can truly come up with ways to solve various problems. And so if you have children, unfortunately, yes. And also, unfortunately, of course, nowadays, well, it really is a difficult situation, I understand. Parents are working practically 25 hours a day. That's how it is. And not knowing what to do with their kids, sometimes they just turn on the TV for them, and the children, well, excuse me, but I'll show you now with this completely blank expression. Literally from the age of 1, they just stare at these images like this, right? And I found it interesting when a man once wrote to me, "What should I do? My wife, well, our daughter is, I think, 3 years old. The girl hardly communicates with her relatives, with her parents. She barely says anything. My wife wants to take her to psychologists or psychiatrists or who knows whom, but the girl is completely normal because she communicates perfectly with our tablet." Well, comrades, I can tell you one thing. If you don't communicate with your children, if the only interaction you can provide is a tablet, television, the internet, cartoons, or whatever else, then you are not developing your children this way. You really will get, you see, the less imagination a person has, the closer they are to an animal. Honestly, let me tell you this, okay? Therefore, it's exactly because when a person who has read a lot of books looks at, this victim of television, they think, damn, there's something wrong with his head. He's really kind of a primitive person. So if you really want to raise your children to be clever, quick-witted, and successful people who know how to find solutions, get rid of television, the internet, and all that from your life. Read fairy tales to your children, play records for them. If, for example, you can't read to them, buy them records or find children's radio plays. And let your children listen to these stories, and in this way they will train their imagination. When you read books to them, children's books really should have pictures, because there needs to be an example, but the pictures should be still. And when you interact with them, you should tell them, for example, how something moves. Yes, let's see. What sound does the horse make on the road? What sounds do these characters in the pictures make, like geese, swans, or whatever else? Right? That is, you must constantly train. Understand that training the imagination is very important for a child. But it starts with stories, with the stories that you read. The child perceives them by ear and already begins to imagine, already invents their own pictures in their mind. And the last point, what should you do if your child is already completely glued to the TV, already glued to the computer, the phone, or whatever else? It really is very difficult. And as I already mentioned, when a person is deprived of this external source of imagination, they really do, well, kind of display madness, this psychotic breakdown, as if someone were put in that very cell where they go insane in solitary confinement. So I found a very interesting piece of advice. Buy your child's TV, computer, or phone from them. Just actually buy it and really give them money for it. And take it away. And when the child goes around saying, I can't do it, that's it. They took the money, they bought something, they spent it however they wanted, right? Obviously, you're not giving 60,000, right? Just make an agreement. How much do you want for me to buy this TV from you? And give them that money. But now you are taking away these external sources of imagination once and for all, irreversibly. And indeed, you are facing a difficult period because, let me repeat, the function of imagination, this quality of imagination, is firstly very important for a person, and secondly, the more it is atrophied, the closer a person is to the state of an animal. And to evolve is always harder than to degrade. Therefore, for a person to reach the level of imagination that would satisfy them, they need to develop it. This period is quite difficult. That is why, if from an early age you practically don't give a child this, specifically television, right? But instead, you encourage them to imagine on their own. Or if you try to do this when they are already 10 or 15 years old, to take away from a person this external source of imagination. Of course, situations will vary. And the last thing I want to tell you is that when someone has a psychotic breakdown precisely because of this, right? If you take them to a psychiatrist, as you can imagine, no antipsychotics, antidepressants, or tranquilizers will create a person's own imagination. That is simply impossible because the only thing that can truly help is a person's own effort and their own training in developing their imagination. Well, you see, there is really no magic here. So if you have young children whom you can still, in general, limit in this way and, so to speak, take control of the situation, then I highly recommend you do so. And of course, I'll repeat once again that many people come to us, and right now, even among children from well-off families, I must tell you, we are finding serious nutrient deficiencies. Unfortunately, most likely, this is related to overall nutrition, to the general nutritional value of the foods available, and also, as I've already mentioned, as we are now seeing in situations where families come to us, it is connected to the fact that mothers themselves have certain nutritional deficiencies, and this is already being passed on to their children. In other words, bodies are already being formed with certain nutrient deficiencies. So, if we are talking about the biological component of these neurotic reactions, then here we can really help you. And I can tell you, with the only method that is not just effective, but also safe. Because the safest thing you can do for a child's health is to feed them. Here, there is absolutely no way to cause harm, right? And especially if you compare this to neurotropic poisons, which are being offered as the only solution by virtually every field related to psychological problems nowadays. I hope you found this video interesting. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. This was Sofya Dorinskaya with you. All the best.